Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about the Eldar Visarch in 10th edition and asking ourselves whether he's a Simp or a Gimp. So here's the thing about the Visarch. He's always kind of played second fiddle to Yvraine. He's always been better with her as far as his rules go, and oftentimes it just wasn't worth taking him if you weren't going to also take Yvraine, and even then it was debatable. In 10th edition, however, he has changed a little bit, but what we're going to be examining in this video is whether or not he's still worth taking by himself without Yvraine. So without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right into the video. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at the stats, weapons, special rules of the Visarch, his strengths and weaknesses, his combos and synergies, and the role the Visarch plays in an Eldar army and how to make the most out of them. Looking at his stats, he has pretty high movement at 8. This is so he can keep up with things like Harlequin troops, of course, and witches. He has a 2+ save and a 4+ invul, making him reasonably tanky. So this is something that's a little bit rare for Eldar units. Usually they don't get a 2+ save if they're a character. So him getting one is actually kind of a big deal. Makes him a little bit tankier against, low AP weapons. As for his melee damage, he has 5 attacks that have precision, as well as strength 5, AP -4, and damage 2. So in that way, he does hit pretty hard against armored targets as long as they don't have an invulnerable save. He carves up mech targets pretty easily, but because of strength 5, can struggle against tougher units with good invulnerable saves, especially things in Gravis armor or, those kind of equivalent units. As for his abilities, he does give his units fight first, which is a good rule on its face. Fights first is good. It's better than it was last edition, but it's not that great on the Visarch alone, and I'm going to go into why later in this video. As for his other ability, the Champion of Need, he can choose between Sustain 2, Devastating Wounds, or Lethal Hits when fighting in close combat. So this does add to his damage significantly, especially since he does benefit from Strands of Fate and is probably one of the better recipients for it in the fight phase. As far as the units he can basically join a lot of different things. Corsairs, Cabalites, Witches, the Troop, and Storm Guardians. The Troop, however, is really the only thing that's worth the points. I would say probably the Troop and maybe the Corsair Void Scarred. But then again, I really think that he's probably better off with the Troop just because he doesn't really add a lot to the Void Scarred himself. And they don't really add a lot to him. He costs 90 points, which is a bit high considering his damage is not the best on his own though, so he is a little bit expensive. Keep in mind that an Autarch Wayleaper costs 80 points. Yes, this might go up in points when they get nerfed in September, but as of now, the Visarch looks to be more expensive, and he doesn't really give a whole lot more than your regular Wayleaper does. In fact, a lot of people would argue that he gives much less, which I tend to agree with, army-wise. As for his keywords, he does have the infantry keyword, but he doesn't have grenades or anything like that, so unfortunately he won't be benefiting from that stratagem. As for his strengths and weaknesses, his strengths are he is a decent combatant, able to choose a bonus to suit his target. So he's a little bit versatile in the way he can fight in close combat. He is better in close combat than a lot of other Eldar models, so he is better than the Wayleaper in combat, no doubt. But he just doesn't do as much for his army. He does give his units fight first, which is a good ability, but maybe not the best on the Visarch alone. And he also has precision on his attacks, which is really cool. That means he can go in and he can snipe a character out without having to spend the CP on the core rulebook stratagem epic challenge. So for those of you guys who don't know, if you spend a CP, you can actually give a character model in your unit in the fight phase precision attacks. So, for your knowledge. And this is not something that typically comes up in games because usually your characters are just not good enough to be wanting precision attacks anyway, right? Characters are usually tougher, they're usually harder to kill than the bodyguard unit, and most characters like the Wayleaper just don't have the punch necessary to kill decent characters in close combat. So oftentimes you're not going to use it, but it can be useful in certain situations. And his last strength is that he can join units with Yvraine, combining their abilities. And I think Personally, this is the best way to run him, and I'm going to go into why in just a second. However, his weaknesses are his damage isn't great for the cost. So yes, he has good damage, but he's also 90 points. He's almost as much points as Yvraine. So if you put that in perspective, he really doesn't do much more than she does in close combat, and you pay a lot of points for it. And lastly, his fights first is good, but it's not amazing on the squishy units he joins. So he's most likely going to be joining a heavy close combat oriented unit, something like a troop or Corsair Voids Guard maybe. And those units are going to kill their target when they charge in. So fights first is not an ability that really benefits him too much, because no person in their right mind is going to try to countercharge in the next turn a combat oriented unit with fights first. They're just going to shoot them to death, right? So it's not an amazing ability for that reason. Now, it is good in certain circumstances, but just not in this one. So what are the combos and synergies that the Visarch can be a part of? Well, Yvraine gives the unit he's with the durability for fights first to matter. So Yvraine revives models in the unit, and she gives them feel no pain. This is especially good with a troop. So when in combination with Yvraine, the unit actually has enough durability for fights first to matter in prolonged combat. So if you're fighting against a unit of Terminators or something like that, and maybe your opponent really doesn't want to fall back with the Terminators, doesn't want to spend the command points, or doesn't want to use the detachment ability that turn to fall back for free, your opponent might just keep the Terminators in combat, especially if they are on an objective, right? So if that happens, fight first is going to matter, because instead of him fighting in the next turn first, you're going to fight first in the next turn and probably wipe out the rest of his Terminators. So it does give your opponent a little bit of a hard choice to make. The troop itself gives him +1 to wound on the charge, and I've had a few people saying in the comments that the troop only gives the troop +1 to charge, but correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but the ability of the troop says models in this unit, and when leaders join a unit, they count as part of the unit. So I think they get +1 to wound as well on their melee attacks when they charge in. But let me know. I'd love to kind of hear that out and see. It doesn't specifically mention Harlequin models. It just mentions models. So I'm pretty sure Yvraine and or the Visarch can benefit from that +1 to wound as well. The Falcon gives him rerolls to wound, so if he's in a smaller unit coming out of a Falcon, he can reroll to wound, which is nice. Doom gives him +1 to wound against a target unit, which is also great. Again, his strength isn't the greatest, so he kind of needs help wounding things most of the time, and Doom helps him with that. And Guide is good for trying to proc his sustained hits ability if you can line it up correctly. So if there's an opportunity to cast Guide on a big unit with the Visarch, Yvraine, and the troop, that can be a serious Death Star killer. Units of 10 Terminators, gone. Really just can't stand up to this. And that's because, you know, the Visarch and Yvraine have a ton of mortal wound damage. Those 4+ invul saves and armor saves are just not going to matter against them, especially if they're rerolling all their hits. The Harlequins are rerolling all of their hits. And on top of that, you are getting, you know, +1 to wound on charge and things like that. So it's going to be very powerful, and probably not a lot of units can stand up to it. So the real question is the Visarch really worth taking? So a lot of people look at the Visarch, they see the 90 points, and they're like, I could probably spend this on a Way Leaper, so I'm just not going to go with the Visarch. He really doesn't add a lot to the unit. So truthfully, unless you take him with a big troop alongside Yvraine, his points are better spent elsewhere, in my opinion. Now, again, that's just my opinion, but he just doesn't seem to do a lot for smaller units. He has trouble fitting in a Falcon alongside Yvraine, and is a much worse option than either her or a regular troop master for a small unit of Quins. And think about it this way, right? For 90 points, you're getting basically just more devastating wounds or just more high AP attacks. The troop master, for much less points, is giving basically the same thing to his small unit of Harlequins. And because you can't fit Yvraine in a small unit and also have them in a Falcon or something like that, right? And you're not going to fit a small unit in a Wave Serpent, let's be real here. The Visarch's Fight First ability really just falls flat. It's a wasted ability. So what are you paying points for then, right? You're paying points for extra damage, but 90 points can be spent on a lot of other units that can do a lot of damage for you, right? So it's not really worth taking them in that configuration. Now, as a unit of 10, if you're running a big Death Star Cracker or something like that in a Ynnari list, I could definitely see the value of it. And that's actually exactly how I've been running them in my Ynnari list, and it's worked out pretty well. So what is the role of the Visarch in an Eldar army, and how do you make the most out of him? Well, quite simply, the Visarch is good with a large troop alongside Yvraine, because his ability to grant fights first synergizes well with the extra durability Yvraine grants the unit. However, outside of that, I think his value as a standalone leader is questionable, and he's kind of expensive points-wise for the damage he can produce. So again, he's 90 points. That's what you have to consider. What other things in my army can I get with 90 points? And as a matter of fact, you can get a lot of different units that can deal pretty good damage for 90 points. Right? I mean, think about it. You can get a whole nother unit of 6 Quins for that cost. Or you can get a unit of Wind Riders. Or you can get, tons of other stuff. A unit of Striking Scorpions. And they're going to do more damage. And probably be better for your army overall than just having the Visarch in the unit. And I do think it's kind of sad, and it's a reason why you don't see the Visarch a lot in Eldar armies, because he really just doesn't add a lot unless you take him in a very specific build. And that build just happens to be, kind of the Harlequin Death Star with Yvraine and him included. Now, this Death Star is very powerful, don't get me wrong, but it is a lot of points and it must be used carefully. I mean, him and Yvraine alone cost 190 points, plus a max unit of Quins is 180. That's like a 370 point unit, right? That's pretty insane. So, to make the most out of that kind of Death Star, you really need to go after other Death Stars. This unit is a Death Star cracker, and I believe that's where the Visarch belongs best. So, in conclusion, the Visarch is a really cool model that works well in a large troop with Yvraine, but outside of that, he really just doesn't do much. Unfortunately, he is really a perfect example of a leader whose abilities only work out well in a very specific unit loadout. So, the question we asked at the beginning of this video was Simp or Gimp, and I would have to say fully and wholeheartedly, the Visarch is a Simp, because he only really works well with Yvraine. And unfortunately, when he's not with her, he's very uncomfortable and socially awkward. So do him and yourself a favor and save yourself the embarrassment and put him with Yvraine if you do take him. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last months. Your help is greatly appreciated. If you do want to become a Patreon member, I have free trials activated, which grants you permanent access to our Discord community, a community of Eldar players who likes to talk about strategies, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. I also have a channel store page if you're interested in grabbing some Eldar-inspired apparel to rep your local game store. And lastly, I have an Amazon affiliate page for those of you looking to save some money on Eldar miniatures via Amazon. In the US, the Combat Patrol currently costs around $113, which is a lot of savings, so do consider picking that up if you're interested in the Combat Patrol. And the link for that will also be in the description. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Peace out. Have some great games this weekend, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.